As you may know by now, I have an interest for tragedy that happens at theme parks. I'm just fascinated with how poor practices and neglect can cause a chain reaction that can end the lives of many. More often than not, these theme park rides are less predictable than the staff might think, and whether it's a budgetary issue or ill-informed staff members, ignoring the problem can be deadly. Today, we take a look at 5 theme park rides that, without the proper care or maintenance that they required, became death traps. First on our list is properly named the Ghost Train. Located in Luna Park in New South Wales, Australia, the Ghost Train was designed and constructed in 1931. On the night of June 9th, 1979, a fire broke out at about 10:15 p.m. Due to understaffing in the park and inadequate coverage of the ride, the fire spread across the coaster quickly before the firefighters could arrive. When they did arrive, they were met with low water pressure from the park and had to take water straight from the harbor to try to control the blaze. About 35 people were said to be riding the car that night, and when staff started to see thick smoke bellowing from the tunnel as the doors opened to let them in, they pulled an alarm and they grabbed customers from their ride as they exited the other side of the tunnel. Later, survivors described the horrific detail of being taken by the car through some doors and suddenly being surrounded by fire. A few of them were even found wandering away from the ride after it was over, covered in soot, in a daze. Not everybody on the ride was so lucky, however. After the fire brigade got the situation under control, they found 6 children and 1 adult huddled together in death. They managed to escape their cars during the ride, but succumbed to the smoke shortly after. Luna Park was advised before the fire to install sprinklers, but of course they never did. The true cause of the fire has never been discovered, but the explanations range from arson to faulty wiring to a fire demon. Located on the Gold Coast, Australia, Dreamworld was home of the Thunder River Rapids ride. Nestled in the Town of Gold Rush section of the park, the ride was considered anything but dangerous once you saw how tame it was. Riders would load into a circular disc of a raft that held up to 6 passengers and could be rotated on the waters at the hands of the guests. The day of tragedy in question was on October 25th, 2016, when a group of 6 loaded into the disc to head down the rapids for fun. The ride was designed to have guests flow down the rapids the whole time, then at the end they would be taken up a steady, slow conveyor belt back to the loading station. The 6 guests were rounding the finish line of the ride when, to their terror, they found themselves coming up upon an empty raft sitting dead on the tracks of the conveyor belt. A malfunction had taken place that day in a large water pump that caused the level of the water to drastically drop. As a result, the rafts were getting stuck on the conveyor belt. This wasn't the first but the 3rd time this malfunction had happened that day, and the 5th time that week. When the group's raft collided with the empty raft for the 3rd time, it flipped vertically. As the conveyor belt tore away at their raft, it also tossed the passengers onto the conveyor belt, where 4 of them were crushed or succumbed to the waters rushing below it. 2 children managed to jump from the ride and escape, but as paramedics had to drain the water, they discovered the other 4 the next day and were mortified. The pump had no automatic shutdown feature for the ride in the event that this happened, and in the 30 years of the ride in operation, it was bound to fail eventually. After having failed 4 times already that week, this ride should have been shut down. Unfortunately, it had to take the lives of 4 people before Thunder River Rapids was put down for good. Claiming the title of worst roller coaster disaster in history, the Big Dipper was located in Battersea Park, England. The incident took place on May 30th, 1972, just 2 years after a fire had also broken out on the same ride. We're off to a good start. The coaster was the main attraction of the park, opening in 1951 as part of the Festival of Britain, which attracted millions of guests in just that summer alone. On this tragic night in question, the coaster was ascending its first incline out of the station when a cable snapped, losing its grip on the car. The train fell backwards towards the station and hit a sharp turn, causing the last of the cars to derail off the track. Brakes on the ride had failed, and the manual brakeman was doing his best, but was unable to bring the coaster to a safe stop. The incident is recalled by survivor Carolyn, who was 14 years old at the time of the ride and got a front row seat to the horror. She states, "Most of the carriages didn't go around the bend. One detached and went off the side through a wooden hoarding. People were groaning and hanging over the edge. It was awful." Carolyn was stranded in a relatively undamaged car about 15 meters up with a bunch of her friends and a girl sitting next to her who just wanted to get out. In an attempt to do so, she leaned over to the railing, but it gave way and she fell out of the car, plummeting to her death. "I told everyone to stay where they were as I tried to find a way down, but I realized as I was walking down, I was walking on blood," Carolyn recalls. "I looked up, and next to the cartridge of people, they were hanging all over the tracks. There was blood everywhere." 5 kids were killed and 13 more were injured on the Big Dipper that night, in a tragedy that sounds like it was straight out of Final Destination 3. Carolyn states that none of the survivors were even interviewed after the tragedy, no investigation was done, and no questions were asked. Nobody knows why the cable snapped that night. The manager and engineer of Funfair was accused of manslaughter, but it was later acquitted. It's truly the epiphany of injustice. Space Journey was located in Shenzhen, China, when tragedy struck on June 29, 2010. The ride was supposed to simulate a rocket launch, holding passengers in rows of 2 in cars as they spun around a domed room that had video footage of space on the inside. At 4:45 p.m., in the middle of a simulation, one of the cars that was holding 44 passengers became loose and lost power. Guests outside explained that they heard a large crash and then banging around on the inside of the structure as the car started to slam against the wall. Those inside were helpless to escape their death trap of a ride as they were held up in the air and they started to smell burning. The nightmare was far from over, as the car suddenly detached from the spinning core and plummeted 35 feet to the ground, turning upside down and dropping passengers whose seatbelts couldn't hold them. Security was in a panic at first and didn't really know how to help. Out of the 44 passengers, 6 were killed, 10 were seriously injured. More than a dozen were knocked unconscious and sent to the hospital almost 2 hours after the accident occurred. There's no conclusion as to what happened to the 2-year-old ride to cause such a horrific accident, but ground down equipment is to blame today. The Smiler is the only ride that's still in operation today. Located in Staffordshire, UK, the steel roller coaster was opened in 2013 and already has a questionable reputation. With an impressive world record for the most inversions on a roller coaster, the Smiler has a spider-like structure that's divided into 5 sections that allows 5 different cars to run at once. Each section has a different theme that is supposed to manipulate the rider into smiling. On day 1, there were already problems. The ride was scheduled for a celebrity preview on May 17, 2013, but was delayed due to a malfunction. The car got stuck on the first uphill incline, trapping passengers for roughly 30 minutes. This was just the first of 3 stallings that the ride would have in the first 2 months of its opening. By July, the Smiler had to be evacuated because of debris falling from the track. Eyewitnesses say that the debris was a foot-long metal bar, and it caused two sections of the track to disengage and created a small gap. Just a month later, the ride was closed again for 5 days after cracks were found at the base of its supports. Then in November of the same year, 4 guests were injured when they got hit in the head by guide wheels that had fallen off of the support chain. You could say that the ride got its first taste of hurting people. The incident in question that made it the worst disaster in Alton Towers history took place on June 2nd, 2015. At 1 p.m., the ride was operating normally, even though there were 46-mile-per-hour winds, and it shouldn't have been operational with anything above 34. Just shortly after 1 p.m., however, an alarm went off indicating that there was a fault. The ride had to be stopped and evacuated, and the operator called over the park's engineer to take a look. Taking advantage of the ride being down, park officials decided to add the 5th car to the ride because it was particularly busy in the park that day. As the empty car was being added, another car was being sent around the track as a test, but it failed to make the uphill incline, giving the same fault as before. 2 electrical engineers were called to the scene to fix the problem, but they weren't told about the additional 5th car. As the test car returned to the station, they sent it around the track again, but it failed to complete a loop. Unknown to them, the 5th car was now sitting in the station, and they didn't know it was there. At 1:42 p.m., they thought they had all the cars back in the station. There were 4, right? Right? Thinking that the test was complete, engineers okayed the ride to be opened, and the Smiler was once again up and running. Passengers loaded into the first car and were sent off, but on the first incline, they were stopped because of a safety warning indicating there was something on the tracks. Engineers once again jumped to the scene, but counted 4 cars on the track. Everything was good to go, according to them. Reports say that the engineers were under pressure to keep the rides up and running quickly, so he chalked this down to a system error, with park management demanding less downtime and bonuses on the way if he could get the car up and running. He overrode the system's warning and sent a car full of 16 people on their way. Passengers watched in horror as they careened towards the empty train, screaming for this to be stopped, but it was already too late. The accident was equivalent to a 90-mile-per-hour car crash. Passengers were left hanging in the air, trapped by twisted metal and steel. It took 20 minutes for the first phone call to be made to emergency services, and a grueling 5 hours for them to be rescued. Imagine being trapped with such pain and destruction all around you. You and your passengers, losing blood, dying. All 16 passengers were rescued from the ride, but not without life-altering injuries. 2 of the teenagers had to have legs amputated due to the severity of the damage. There was broken ribs, shattered knees, and a punctured lung. Park officials admitted to breaching safety protocols, but despite this, the Smiler was reopened 9 months later as if nothing had ever happened. This is just 5 theme park rides that altered or ended the lives of many, and I'm well aware that there's many more to cover. Let me know what stories you've heard. And have you ever felt unsafe on a ride yourself? These things fascinate me because we're content with the idea that we're safe no matter what. But when parks start to ignore protocols, safety precautions, and put money over people, the odds start slipping out of your favor. Thanks for watching. For more oddities, true crime, true horror, and bad horror movie reviews, consider subscribing. Game with me on Twitch, follow me on Twitter, and until next time, be well.